Hello, grade 12 scholars. It's Miss Novak here, and we are back with week 5, lesson 20 of your ELA online learning. You know what to expect from these lessons, but just in case, you can expect variety. Each video is going to be a little bit different. You can also expect to see a list of materials and resources so that we know exactly what we need to make our way through the week. I'll go through a brief overview of the learning and the different components of the lesson. We'll next move through a model of that day's learning task. So even just a small component so you have a better idea of how to launch into that independently. And we'll make sure to preview learning for the next day's lesson. This week we'll be studying an excerpt from the History of the English Church and People by Bede. Some people might say the Venerable Bede. We'll spend some time today looking at some of the vocabulary that's included in the text, skimming through the text to see what it's all about, and then completing a writing activity that, yep, you guessed it, includes the vocabulary words. Before we launch into our learning, let's make sure to remind ourselves of the importance of sharing our learning with others. This is going to be a good lesson. We're going to have some vocabulary words in it, so it's going to be even more important to reinforce our understanding by talking. Next, we will travel back to the world of fluency, make sure that we are engaging in that practice and review exactly what that's all about. And lastly, we'll always make time to read for 20 minutes. Do you have your book on deck? I know that I do. All right, let's get going. Ah, yes, another pictogram puzzle. Let's take about 15 seconds, or pause the video if you'd like. The words up on the screen, the shapes, and see if you can tell what word or phrase this represents. Take a minute. All right, we're about ready to reveal the answer. And the answer is top secret. I got as far as the most important secret. I didn't quite get there in that 15 seconds, but hopefully this gave you a little boost of confidence and gets your engines fired up to do some deeper thinking around vocabulary words in this lesson. Our lesson materials. All of our lesson materials can be found inside of our learning packets. We know this. We are on lesson 20, which is located on page 67. Your note catcher, not surprisingly, on page 68. The text, which is short but meaty, is located on pages 64 to 66. And of course, have something to write with. I've now adopted the practice of carrying around a highlighter. This is kind of a cool highlighter tool that I found. At any rate, make sure that we can really fancy up that text and annotate it to deepen our understanding. Today's learning target is all about vocabulary. I can use my background knowledge and understanding of key vocabulary words to write about a topic. So we'll look at the words in context, we'll also look up some dictionary definitions of the words, and we'll be able to use them in writing by the end of the lesson pretty thoughtfully. To begin our lesson overview. So we'll start this lesson with a jumpstart activity that asks you to think about a time period in history that you would most like to travel back to. We'll document our thoughts on our note catcher. Next, we're going to be reading the text, or should I say skimming through the text. I couldn't help but read it. Anyways, we're going to be looking and lifting up those parts that seem interesting to us. We'll also be paying particular attention to those paragraphs and sentences that contain those blue vocabulary words. They're highlighted in blue. Okay, I'm not making this up. Next, you'll talk with a family member, caregiver, or friend about these vocabulary words in context, and you'll try to use them inside of a conversation. Last but not least, we'll ask you to apply your new knowledge of these words to complete a short writing assignment that details and documents a place that you have visited. Doesn't mean that you need to make up a tale about visiting an elaborate place or a time period in history, although you could go that way if you wanted to, but just some place that you visited and like to write a little bit about. Let's get started. So this week we'll learn about the history of Britain in an excerpt from A History of the English Church and People, a piece written by Bede, an 8th century philosopher. In this text, Bede discusses the physical location and the size of Britain and Ireland and their early inhabitants. He does this in great detail, using vivid descriptions that allow us to infer the affection that he had from his home country. He had a lot of pride in his home country. His text will help you build background knowledge to explain Britain's history. As you read, continue to keep the essential question of the unit in mind. What does it mean to call a place a home? You'll also want to refer to the guiding questions as well. What makes a place important enough to write about? What makes it so memorable, right, and lasting in your own personal experiences that you want to put pen to paper? And in what ways is home both a place and a state of mind? We'll launch into these questions and revisit them over the course of this week. Let's dive into the author's background just a little bit. I can assure you that if this piques your interest, you might want to go and research more about Bede online. He's actually considered to be one of the greatest teachers and writers of the early Middle Ages. So let's launch in. He was born near the monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul at Jarrow in Northumbria, now northeast England. He was sent to live in the monastery at the age of 7, only 7, and was ordained as a deacon at 19 and became a priest at 30. So he lived a quite holy existence. Bede rarely left the monastery and followed a strict daily schedule of prayer, daily study, and teaching and writing. And during his lifetime, he completed more than 60 books on religious and scientific topics, most of which have survived to the current day. It's like 1,300 years later, literally almost. It's really important to note too that he has spent the majority, if not all of his life, inside of a small space, but yet his writing is so informed. So just think of the effects that his studies had on his writing. In our last text, Back to My Own Country, we learned about modern-day Britain and its history through a first-hand account. Before that, we learned about the country by reading an informational article, A Changing World. It'll be really interesting to pair our understanding from last week with our understandings of this week to form a full-throttle picture of the history of Britain. Well, maybe not full throttle, but we'll definitely be much more informed about the early years. I love this thinking component of today's lesson. So it asks you, if you could travel back in time, what period of history would you most like to visit? What would you choose to do and see during your time there? I honestly could spend all lesson speaking about this. Partially because it changes quite rapidly, but I think it would be really interesting to visit the 1960s and the social changes that were going on at that time. I'd allow myself to be a part of those things, which I still feel very passionate about. I'm talking as if I lived back then. Okay, I'm getting off tangent, but really think about it. And if you need to do a quick little study of different decades in American history or in history around the world, feel free to do so. So your reading task today is asking you to skim the text to get an idea of what kind of information you're going to be learning about in each paragraph. Like I said before, I couldn't help myself, and so I started reading, and I basically completed the whole first read. But we're also asking you to understand or to put a star next to anything that stands out to you. Please pay close attention to those paragraphs and those sentences that include those blue vocabulary words as well. Bonus points to whoever can tell me about this little icon right over here, right? Think about this, the Bounce Pages app. If you haven't used it before, play around with it now because you can actually go ahead and scan. I could do it right now if I wanted to. And there's all these little like circles that come around. They just want to grip at a picture on a page and read the text out loud to you and give you other useful information. So honestly, if you haven't played around with the Bounce Pages app, now's a great time to experiment. Now remember, while we're not completing a traditional first read at this point, I want to bring you into a quick model of moving through those steps when I'm skimming those paragraphs. As always, we're noticing, we're annotating, we're connecting, and we will soon be responding, but I just want to give you a quick model of this before we get started on our own. So as you can see here, this is just paragraph 1. What I decided to do here is that I noticed the word abounding, right? It's in blue, one of the vocabulary words from the text. It's in the same sentence as the word plentiful. So they might mean the same thing. Okay, let me go ahead and read this paragraph out loud so we can really sink our teeth into the importance of annotating and thinking through our annotations. There are many land and sea birds of various species, and it is well known for its plentiful springs and rivers abounding in fish. There are salmon and eel fisheries, while seals, dolphins, and sometimes whales are caught. There are also many varieties of shellfish, such as mussels, in which are often found excellent pearls of several colors, red, purple, violet, and green, but mainly white. Cockles are abundant and beautiful scarlet dyes extracted from them, which remains unfaded by sunshine or rain. Again, the word plentiful is in the same sentence as the word abounding, which is a vocabulary word. It seems like there's no scarcity that we happen to be reading about. To confirm my guess that these two words are quite similar in meaning, I kept reading and noticed that the author is talking about the many varieties of shellfish. So we kind of list them all off. And he also says that cockles are abundant, which I know means a lot of. So I'm going to start to infer that abounding means overflowing. You might come up with a different definition on your own, especially after you look at it in the dictionary. But what I did here is I used a lot of context clues to help lead me to that first thought meaning. The talking component of today's lesson asks you to lift up those vocabulary words with someone else. So the vocabulary words for today are breadth, abounding, and innumerable. That first word, breadth, abounding, and innumerable. I know that someone's going to come at me and say that sounds like breath. It's breathed, right? Okay, we'll get it right at some point. And we're going to ask you to discuss those vocabulary words in context. Do you recognize, too, the prefix of the word, the suffix, the base of any of the words? Because this can also help lead you to its true meaning. And after your discussion, we're going to ask you to guess the meaning of the word. So we're going to have our first go at it, reference the dictionary, have a third go at it, write about it. We're really going to get to know these words. Today's writing assignment will ask you to apply your knowledge of these new vocabulary words in a writing sample. So it doesn't have to be super elaborate, right? We're writing about a place that we've visited before, and we're making sure to include each of the vocabulary words, breadth, bounding, and innumerable, at least once. Bravo if you can include them more than once. That means your paragraph's going to probably be a little bit longer, but that's fine, right? And remember, this doesn't have to be an exciting vacation that you're writing about. This can simply mean visiting your friend down the street, or maybe even your grandmother's house. Whatever really sparks your interest, just make sure to be intentional about the way you use those vocabulary words. If any questions pop up along the way, or if you have something to celebrate about today's lesson, feel free to email your teacher. You can reach them at their first name, their last name at detroitk12.org. I'm sure they would love to hear from you. Of course, a preview of tomorrow's lesson. The target tomorrow is, I can identify details in a text and use them to determine the purpose of key sections. I'm going to reiterate the fact that we aren't delving into the text as a whole. Tomorrow, we're actually just going to be looking at paragraphs 1 and 2 and asking ourselves why the author decided to include some key details and how they enhance our understanding of the topic. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much for learning with me today. I know this was a quick and powerful lesson, but I can assure you, you're going to love using these new vocabulary words in your conversation. So a couple of quick reminders before we close up. Don't forget to talk about your reading and your writing with someone. Practice using those vocabulary words in conversation and encourage others to do the same. Next, make sure you are charting your reading progress. I already know that you're reading for 20 minutes every day, but make sure that you're noting that down in your reading log, which is located right here in your packets. And next, lastly, don't forget about fluency practice. I know we mentioned that this week's text is pretty meaty and sometimes difficult to understand. So I really encourage you to engage in fluency practice, review the directions that are on page 2, and use this text as a launch pad to improve your reading fluency. See you soon, tomorrow.